is to do much what I did in the first session, which is really to give you an autobiographical account of my own experience with diaries and autobiographies, which is the theme of this talk, and how I found them useful in my work. By personalizing it, I hope it will make it more interesting for you. And as I say, if things come up during each section, you want to ask me questions, do. So, what have diaries meant to me as a source for academic research? In the mid-1960s, when I started my research, the great move in history was away from political event-based history to social and cultural history, broadly what the Annales school called the study of mentalité. This required a new set of sources from the ones that have been conventional in history. Before, one had rather exterior sources of large events, but now with this kind of history of the late 60s, one needed materials and sources that got one inside the mind worlds and social worlds of people living in the past. And so when I did a DPhil in history at Oxford, I was very keen to find those kinds of sources. And the first one of the early ones I discovered, because there were some references to witchcraft in it, was the diary of an English clergyman. And I think that's why I've been asked to give this talk, really, because whoever organised them knew that I had actually written a book based on an English clergyman's diary, which is on the reading list here. This is the fully published version, published by the British Academy, of a 17th century English diary, the best country diary of the 17th century, along with one other, the sort of Pepys of the countryside. He lived in Essex at Earl's Colne, and my wife and I edited this diary, and I wrote a book about it. This diary allowed me to get inside the mind of a mid-17th century Englishman to a certain extent. But at the same time, and if you're interested in reading the diary, it's on my website. If you go to my website and look under Village Study of Earl's Colne, the whole diary has now been put on in electronic form, connected to all the other records of that village. So you can see all the background to the diary as well. But this took me, in the diary you had records of his dreams, his relations with his children. I was particularly interested in family life, so my book was called The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn. But his whole social world was illuminated. And when I discovered what a good source it was, I started getting interested in other English diaries. And the favourite ones, I put some of them here. Some great English diaries are listed here. If you're interested in diaries, the diaries of Oliver Hayward, Samuel Pepys, Boswell, Thomas Turner, James Woodford and Kilvert are famous English diaries. All of them worth reading in their own right, as well as sources. So, in the introduction to the Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn, I speculated briefly on the reasons for keeping diaries. Diary keeping is a rather unusual phenomenon. In fact, I was wondering as I came along, how many of you keep diaries yourselves? One. Well, you all should start as from tomorrow. You'll regret it if you don't. I put it off till 1978. I'm now typing up my diaries, or my wife is, and I realized what a sadness it was that I didn't keep them before that. I should have done, even if they're quite cursory, and even if they just say what you're doing and not much reflection. Later on, you'll find them fascinating. While you're writing them, it's a bore, but in a few years' time, you'll find them very interesting and important. There are other reasons for keeping them, but I really would suggest that you think about it. We're usually put off by the fact that early in our childhood or teens, we're told by our parents or given diaries, and we try and keep diaries, and they're no use. But for an academic, the reflection that is allowed through keeping a diary is, I think, very important. And if you can, think about starting one as from tomorrow. Anyway, Diary keeping is clearly unusual both for you and for people in different civilizations. There are very few civilizations in which there are diaries kept. And it's a fairly recent phenomenon. That's to say, it's a post-Renaissance phenomenon, mainly confined to Western Europe. The other great diary-keeping civilization, apart from some of the Western European nations, are the Japanese, who from the 8th, 9th century have kept diaries. Why do people keep them? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is as aide-memoire, just to remember things by. Social and economic accounting devices to show that you're progressing, that you're doing things. To slow the passage of time, it allows you to go back in memory to previous times. And as a form of introspection and spiritual introspection. That is why the great diary movement developed in 16th, 17th century Protestant societies, because it was a way of really talking to God. You talked to yourself, you reviewed your life. Many clergymen encourage people to keep diaries as a way of finding out whether they were on the right path in general. So introspective Protestantism is one reason for diary keeping. Whether it's an effect or a cause, it's also somehow related to individualism, to the concept of the ego, the internal ego, as an individual. And you look in your diary as you do look into a mirror and see yourself in it in a rather peculiar way. And I think that is one of the reasons why two rather individualistic societies, that is Japan and parts of Western Europe, are great diary keeping. Now, why these societies should be so individualistic is another matter, which I've tried to pursue in relation to the effects of glass on introspection, which is one of the main theories about the growth of introspection in Europe after the 15th, 16th centuries. But for whatever reason, people in the West did increasingly keep diaries and autobiographies. Now, autobiographies, of course, are different. Diaries you keep day by day, and they're a very good source, but usually there's not much pattern in them. They're just random events that occur to you. Autobiographies are written often towards the end of your life, or when you feel that there isn't too much more time, and so you write an autobiography. Now, I've put a few famous autobiographies on the sheet here as well. I put Alice Thornton because she's be nice to have a woman, but there's also Harriet Martineau. These are basically all the ones on this list, the ones that I've enjoyed very much. Alice Thornton, one of the early women diarists. Benjamin Franklin. Have any of you read Benjamin Franklin's diary, autobiography? Yes. Well, of course, it's famous because much of Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism was based on Franklin. So our view of the modern world really comes out of an assessment of Franklin's autobiography, a fascinating document. Francis Place, the great demographer and social commentator at the beginning of the 19th century, at the time of Malthus, is another very interesting diary. Harriet Martineau was a great woman, and her diary likewise. And Mark Rutherford is a very moving diary of what happens to someone who is assailed by religious doubts. Now, you can actually get a kind of fictional, I hadn't put it on the list, but it suddenly occurs to me, you can get quasi-fictional autobiographies. Probably the best account of Calvinist terror, of the belief in the devil and the introspection of deeply religious people, is a book called The Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Have any of you heard of this? By James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd, written in the early part of the 19th century. And it's a kind of detective story of a man who murders someone and then is pursued by the devil. And it's the best single account of what it's like to be a religious fanatic that I know of. It's a sort of quasi-autobiographical, it's not a real autobiography. So, through these kinds of sources, if you're a historian, you can, and obviously they go through into the 19th and 20th century, and I've put a few guides at the top of collections of British diaries and English diaries and so on, so that you can pursue and have a look and see it. What I did was just to look through and see if there was any diarist who was described as being interested in things that I was interested in. Those sorts of things, for instance, for a long time I was working on the theme of marriage and sexual behaviour and kinship, so I looked to see if there were diarists who talked a good deal about that. And I used diaries and autobiographies a lot in my book on marriage and love. Of course, as you probably know, not just if you're a historian, but certainly if you're a criminologist and if you're a geographer, you have to treat all sources with great suspicion. I probably said this before, but basically you have to interrogate sources. You have to treat them as witnesses, as you would in a criminal forensic investigation. And a diary, so you have to ask yourself when you read a diary, what is this person hiding? Why are they biased in this way? What can't you find out? What wouldn't you expect from this kind of source? And so you don't trust diaries. They're terribly and deeply revealing often, both by what they say and by what they don't say. But they have all sorts of biases, depending on the social position of the observer, their interests, and so on. No diary is going to give you a clear vision of the past, but often they give you little insights which you won't get from any other kind of source. Now, as I thought there would be some social scientists, and well, perhaps I'll just pause at that point. Are there any questions about it, the use of diaries by historians? So what's that done? Lights. Interesting. You put two switches on and they go on. So I think they do this with monkeys to see if they can type Shakespeare. But, that's blackboard lights. Okay. Let's see what happens if I press this. Well, there we are. There's one. Very strange. Sometimes they go on. Does that help? No. I'll just try a few more random. There are 12 switches here. Ah, that one does something. Then it turns itself off. Okay, I'll try and stand here. It's better without that one. Oh, well, I thought you might say that. That's well. Remote control for lighting. There we are. Okay, on with modern technology. Right, let's move on to anthropological use of diaries very briefly. In the middle of the 1970s, another value for autobiographical materials began to dominate my life anyway. I had become an anthropologist and done fieldwork in the Himalayas, and I became interested in comparing civilizations and in the peculiarity of the English, as E.P. Thompson called it. And the peculiarity of the West. This led me to works on the origins of English individualism and the culture of capitalism and so on. And I began to use diaries and other material for comparing civilizations. Now this takes me on to something which isn't a pure diary in the sense of a day-to-day account, but travellers' accounts. These are often extremely revealing. I have a collection of diaries, and I also have a collection of travellers who go from A to B and notice things. Travel writing of an autobiographical account is often the best single insight you'll get into a culture or civilization. And I put some great autobiographical travel writing down on this list here. Arthur Young, the agricultural writer, travelled all over Europe, Ireland, France and so on, and also wrote an autobiography. So if you're an 18th century specialist and you want to know the state of Europe in the 18th century, Arthur Young would be a very good start. And he travelled around England with great care too. If you wanted to know about 19th century America, from a rather jaundiced anti-American view, then you could do better than read Anthony Trollope's mother's Domestic Manners of the Americans, which didn't go down well in America at all. Very withering but amusing account of what America was like in the middle of the 19th century. If you want to read the single best book about 19th century England, as far as I can see, and the English character, you read the travels of a very scholarly French littérateur, Hippolyte Taine, and his notes on England in the 1860s, 70s is an absolutely wonderful anthropological account of what England was like in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Or if you wanted to read a fantastic account of Europe in the 1930s, 1920s, 30s, then Alexander Herzen's My Past in Thoughts in 4 volumes is an absolute classic and recently republished. Or if you wanted to read what I think is one of the great sets of autobiographical travel writing, half travel, half autobiography, then the works of Arthur Koestler. Have any of you read any Arthur Koestler? I just came on Arrow in the Blue by accident. He wrote about 4 or 5 autobiographical works. He was famous for other things, but like writing the best book on communism, account of communism, perhaps Darkness at Noon. But he had a photographic memory, remembered everything, and his autobiographies and travel writings give you a fantastic, you just pick it up and you're immediately in the world he's describing of mid-20th century politics and society. So you have these vignettes of different civilizations. Some of the best books on England are by Indians who come to England. Some of the best books on France are by Englishmen who go to France. There are a whole series of these things. But I'd like to just pick out a couple of my favorites who you won't otherwise encounter probably. The first is, I think, I haven't read everything obviously, but I think she's the best Victorian travel writer and perhaps the greatest travel writer of all time. And this is someone called Isabella Bird. Have any of you heard of Isabella Bird? There's no reason why you should. Again, I accidentally fell on her. Isabella Bird, or Bishop, she married a Mr. Bishop later on. I first discovered in her work on Japan. In fact, I first went to work in Japan because of Isabella, because she, in the 1870s, visited and then wrote a book called Unbeaten Tracks in Japan. And she was the first European, as far as I know, and perhaps the first person to go and live with what were known as the hairy Ainu, the Aboriginal inhabitants of the northern island of Japan. She spent 2 or 3 weeks with them as a kind of anthropologist, and she wrote an account of it in great detail. So she travelled across Japan, but this was later on. She started travelling at 55. She had a bad back. Her doctors had condemned her to an early death. But before she died, she decided to do a little travel and went to Australia and back. And on the way back, she suddenly felt much better, threw away her medicines and started travelling. And she went across the Rocky Mountains twice. She went through the back roads of Japan, as I have mentioned. She went further than any European had ever been, up the Yangtze Gorge and onto the borders of Tibet, which is one of her greatest books, Up the Yangtze Gorge and Beyond. She travelled through Persia in midwinter for 5 months, dressed as just in a burqa and so on, in 2 volumes. She went up to Tibet. She went through Korea and Manchuria for about 9 months. She climbed up the highest volcano in Hawaii, and she ended up at 75 riding a black stallion lent to her by the King of Morocco. Fantastic. And also her autobiographies are in the form of letters home, which she wrote every week. And so they are actually descriptions of things that are happening to her, and then are put into books when she got back. She was nearly killed dozens of times, nearly dead, falling off cliffs or being stoned by Chinese or whatever. But she writes with great humour and insight, and the writing is superb. It's the sort of thing to read in bed, because it just takes you into all these worlds. The other great autobiographical thing that you won't come across otherwise is the work of Yukichi Fukuzawa. Have any of you heard of Yukichi Fukuzawa? Those from Japan have. Yukichi Fukuzawa? Yes, Fukuzawa Yukichi. I'd never heard of him when I went to Japan in 1990, but I met someone who was doing a PhD on him. He is the most important social reformer and philosopher in Japan. He made modern Japan, really. He's on the 10,000 yen note at the moment still. He founded the modern educational system, Keio University. He founded the art of public speaking. He introduced accounting into Japan. He introduced bookshops, the Maruzen, even how to make a rifle, and let alone political systems and everything. And so he is a really great combination of practical reformer and philosopher. His theory of civilization, based on John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville and others, is a very important philosophical work. So if you want to understand modern Japan, you need to understand Fukuzawa. If you want to understand Fukuzawa, you read my book called The Making of the Modern World, the second half if you want. You can do other things, like read his autobiography, because it's a delightful, it is a very selective thing. It was written just before he died, when he was about 60. But as an autobiography of a man growing up in an ancien regime, an ancient world of samurai, lower samurai background, and then travelling to the West, going to America, going to Europe, then going back into Japan and trying to import Westernism into Japan. It's an absolutely fascinating account which you wouldn't get from any other source. And the third favourite, who's here, is again to do with Japan. Edward Morse was an American trained as a zoologist. He was an expert on tiny crustacea. He was trained by a man called Agassiz, who was the great 19th century zoologist, entomologist, and so on. And Morse went to Japan in about 1870 with this trained eye for minute detail. And he became interested in the whole of Japanese culture, and he wrote a wonderful 2-volume travel book called Day by Day in Japan, which is in the UL. He also wrote the greatest book that's ever been written on Japanese architecture, Japanese homes and their environs. He also became the greatest expert in the world on Japanese pottery. His 2-volume catalogue in the British Museum is unsurpassed, and he could defeat any Japanese at ascribing pots to their makers. And he described in great detail and do little drawings everything about Japanese life, from their material culture to their social systems and everything. And therefore, if you want a lovely book, I was involved in a television series once which involved filming in Japan, and the film director, producer, took Morse with him, and as he was doing the filming, he was reading Morse, and he said it was enormously inspiring. The last, I said I was only going to give you 2, but I'll give you one further autobiographical source which you may not have thought about, and this is the work of great social theorists. Very often these people didn't actually write autobiographies. That is, when I say great social theorists, I mean people like Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Malthus, Tocqueville, and so on. They often didn't actually write autobiographies. Some of them did do a little bit. But because they're so famous, their work has been preserved, their pensées in the case of Montesquieu, their visits to England and the notes they took on them in the case of Tocqueville, everything that's letters of Adam Smith and so on. And what you begin to realize when you read their work carefully is that what their work is really an autobiography. They're trying to sort out in their intellectual endeavors answers to questions which are really autobiographical. In the case of Tocqueville, it's obvious. I was born an aristocrat in the ancien regime, or my parents were. Now I live in a world of democracy and equality. How can I come to terms with this? And he agonizes about this in his ancien regime and in Democracy in America, but he also does it in his letters and papers and so on. So these are autobiographical accounts, and it's a good way to approach them, to see them as a sort of autobiography, which I've tried to do in some of my writing. So that's a little more on autobiographies. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Has anyone got any favourite autobiographies they'd like to add or suggest, or any questions. Okay, shall we move on to the next section? Are there any other questions quickly? Yeah. Now, the next section is another purpose for diaries. In each discipline, there are probably a few classical autobiographical, sometimes described as fictional accounts of how one works. You're starting your research, and it's very difficult to know what you do, how do you behave, and so on. If you can find one or two people you really admire who have kept or published autobiographies about how they worked, a great scientist, a great criminologist, a great lawyer, a great geographer, Vidal de la Blache or whatever who it is, and you can read these, and they give you some indirect but often very deep insights into methodology and approaches which you won't get from any other kind of source. As you're not anthropologists, you won't be particularly interested, but there are 4 or 5 classic anthropological accounts or diaries which I put down on the list here. Malinowski, who some of you may have heard of, wrote a book called A Diary in the Strict Sense of the Term. An Indian anthropologist or anthropologist of India, Veria Elwyn, Leaves from Jungle, and so on. These are classics. Eleanor Bowen, who was a pseudonym for Laura Bohannon, Claude Lévi-Strauss, World on the Wane, Clifford Geertz, who's coming to give the Fraser Lecture here in May, wrote a book which is sort of autobiographical. And these are often give that personal side. As you may have gathered, we're all in a reflexive mood now, and we want to explain how the subjectivities behind our apparently objective accounts of the world. And those subjectivities are often described in diaries and autobiographies. Return to Laughter, for example, by Eleanor Bowen, is an absolute classic of living in and working in another culture in which they believe in witches, in which people are starving, in which there's great insecurity, and she describes this in a very, very personal and warm way. In sociology, there are other classics, and I put 1 or 2 of them down here. John Stuart Mill's autobiography is a wonderful book about a man who was highly overpressurized by his father, James Mill, had a breakdown but became a child prodigy and became one of the great social thinkers of the 19th century. Herbert Spencer's autobiography is another, the simultaneous discoverer of the theory of evolution, the man who invented the competition of species and so on. There's even a biography called something like We Two, which was written by his landlady, or Us Two, which is a rather delightful little book. Beatrice Webb, My Apprenticeship and Our Partnership. Have any of you heard of Beatrice Webb? She was the founder of the LSE. There are various nice stories told about her, but her My Apprenticeship has an appendix which is very useful for any of you because it describes the actual method by which you do research. She says people at Oxford and Cambridge, students, are never deigned to get down to being told how you actually do research. So I'll tell you, being an LSE person. And she has this famous method called One Fact, One Card, which is how she wrote some of those great books, spreading all her little cards around, writing facts down, and then reassembling them. And it is a very interesting, if slightly old-fashioned and positivistic view of how you do social sciences. One of the best sociological accounts I've read of that kind, sort of autobiographical, is by the great American sociologist C. Wright Mills in The Sociological Imagination. Again, there's an appendix on method which is very helpful. If you're a historian and want models of how you work, then Collingwood's autobiography is an absolute classic right across subjects. Both he was a philosopher and a historian, and it combines those two things. The best single book, which I think I mentioned before, about how you do history, Historian's Craft by Mark Bloch is a sort of autobiography as well. If you're interested in how scientific discoveries and breakthroughs are made, then Francis Crick's What Mad Pursuit and The Double Helix, when combined, are a lovely insight into the discovery of DNA. The best single account of how a mathematician and scientist actually works is by the great French mathematician Henri Poincaré, who was the great contemporary of Einstein and simultaneously more or less discovered the theory of relativity, and he was interested in how he made these breakthroughs, and it gives a very good account. If you want to see how you write, it's a bit disappointing, but there's one or two gems in it. Perhaps one of the greatest writers of all time, Rudyard Kipling, wrote a little autobiography called Something of Myself, and he had a lot of tips about how you should write, which you're not taught very much. But if you wanted to see a few tips, you could have a look at that. For instance, he said, and these are useful things for you, never write short, always write what you have to write. If you are in the mood to write, just keep writing. Don't think, oh, I've only got 5,000 words, 10,000 words, and so on. Just write. Later, you can cut away, but never stop yourself. Don't auto-criticize your writing until later. That's the second stage. He used to go through his writing with a black pen and just excise things later on again and again and again to make it pure. But once the inspiration is there, what he called his daimon, his demon, was there, he said, just go on. It'll stop. It'll go off like a light switch, and then you can't go on. But don't turn it off too early. Then there are other accounts. A recent one, for example, from an anthropologist about his experiences and so on, was the late professor of anthropology here, Jack Goody, who's still at St. John's. In his book about anthropology, The Expansive Moment, Chapter 8 is a sort of autobiographical account of how an anthropologist works nowadays. So there are many patterns which you can disagree with, but it's often helpful just to read one or two of these things as an inspiration to your own work. Are there any questions on that, or any suggestions of other things that you find useful? Mid-afternoonitis is striking us all. We all go to sleep at about, at least I always do, at about 2:45 to about 4:45. So we should all just keel over, but there we are. You'll be able to do that after my lecture. No questions? Right, I'm the one person who has to keep going and alert, so let's, in fact I haven't got a great deal more, but this may be useful for you. This is to do with the practice of keeping diaries. Diaries are useful as sources, i.e. reading other people's diaries and autobiographies, but what about your own diary, if you're going to keep one? As I said earlier, I think that anyone who's going to work in the field, and in the field sometimes is thought literally to be somewhere far away and exotic and so on, but as a historian come anthropologist myself, I think the field is anywhere. I have a PhD student at the moment, for example, who's working on broadband and its implications and effects in British culture, and so the field is all around us. It's the computing lab here and so on. You're already, many of you, actually on your field work. You may think you're in the field work training period, which you are to a certain extent, but you're also starting, thinking, analysing, observing, and building up a dossier which you'll use in your research. So we're nearly all straight pitched into the field even before we think we go off to it. And therefore, that's the reason, whether you're working in the university library or in the Institute of Criminology or wherever it is, that I think you should very early on start keeping an intellectual diary come thoughts book. For social scientists and particularly anthropologists, this is undoubtedly the most important of their working tools, that book. you observe lots of things, you keep lots of different kinds of forms of data collection, but what brings it all together is the daily diary. And often it's out of that that you work and write up your thesis, and that I don't think just applies to anthropology. It's true that when I was a historian and doing a history PhD and so on, I didn't keep a diary, but I think I kept all my letters, and I kept copies of all my letters, and I used those as a surrogate diary to a certain extent. But I think you may well find it useful, because that kind of diary is a double thing. You have, today I went and heard an interminable lecture by Professor McFarlane, but something he said struck me that perhaps it would have been useful to do so and so. And then you reflect on things. So the diary is both an account of what you do and gathering of information, but reflecting on it as you're going along. Now, the one problem about well, there are two problems about keeping these things. One is that they become so valuable that if you lose them, you've lost your research. This has happened to a number of people. And so with my students, anyway, as anthropologists who are working in all sorts of parts of the world, I recommend that they never carry this document around with them. In other words, they have a diary in which they keep all their materials and their thoughts and reflections, and they keep it safely locked up in a safe place. And occasionally, no doubt now, put it onto a computer. But they carry around with them. Have I talked to you about this? I can't remember. No? It's quite a useful thing. They carry around with them something very small. I haven't told you about this. Okay. Well, what I learnt after 25 years of doing fieldwork was that you have a small notebook like the University Library Diary, or perhaps the University Diary, a bit smaller perhaps than that, which will fit into the palm of your hand. And you have that with you all the time. And whenever a thought, as Thomas Hobbes would say, darts into your mind, you write it in. Because very often the best thoughts, as Poincaré and others have observed, come when you wake up in the morning, in the middle of the night, etc., on a bus or whatever. You write them down as they occur. And also, this means that very often when you're talking to people, or when you're doing an interview, or whatever you do, you don't want to have, if you go up to someone with your diary and you say, right, and you get out your pen and you say, tell me about your sexual life, which is what anthropologists used to ask, how is it, and so on. It's pretty threatening, even if it wasn't sexual life, whatever you ask them. If, on the other hand, you don't have this large book, which is again like a camera coming between you, and you go up to someone and you say, look, I'm not going to write all this down, but if you say anything very specific, a name, a date, a nice quotation, or some statistics or something, do you mind if I jot it down? People usually don't mind. So you have this thing there, and you just, as they talk, you just jot down a few things, and above all you jot down the heads of what they say. And this could be the case in a seminar as well. You don't write try and keep too detailed notes on what they're saying, but just talked about this, talked about that, mentioned this, and so on. Then if you have this, and you go back to wherever you keep your main diary or your computer, you can usually reconstruct almost everything that was said by just having one line. If you don't do that, it's all forgotten. It's all mushed up. So what I do in the field is to have lots of these little notebooks, which doesn't matter if once they've been transcribed, whether they're lost or not. They're not threatening, and they allow you to spend an hour or so gathering it all together at the end of the day or the following morning. It's got to be done fairly quickly, otherwise you'll forget it. Another kind of diary, which sort of overlaps, is what I call a writing diary. You probably think, as I did, that a model research project consists of setting up a problem, a hypothesis, doing some reading, going out or staying here and gathering the data, and then writing it up. much as an archaeologist might do. They find a site that looks promising and they have some problems in their mind. They go and they dig up all the objects, and then they come back and they rearrange and they write the report on what they've done. And that's what I thought a PhD was. What I've realized more and more, and this is particularly the case with anthropology, but I think it also applies to others, is that you do two periods of field work. You do the field work when you go and apparently are mainly gathering data. Then you come back and you reconstruct all of that material in your mind in a new patterns and fit it in new shapes and so on. And that is often the most difficult part of your research, coming back or staying and then writing up. Obviously with a lot of your disciplines you're doing the two together, but there is a sort of imaginative field work that's going on as well as the actual field work. And in this kind of work is not often recorded. In fact, as far as I know, it's hardly ever recorded. I throw out this challenge to groups of students each year, and no one has come back with anything. But I don't know of any honest account by any historian, by any geographer, by any criminologist, by any anthropologist, sociologist or philosopher about how you actually write and discover new things. There are lots of after the fact, which is what Geertz called it, after the fact accounts, or like Crick and Watson. There are ancient people like G.M. Trevelyan, the historian, and others write autobiographies at the end of their lives, or famous scientists write autobiographies at the end of their lives. These are fictional accounts. They don't really tell you how it was done, because once it's done you can no longer reconstruct. In other words, it's like Captain Cook or Columbus. You can write the account of how you discovered America or Australia afterwards as a synthesized account, but that's not how you discovered it. And it's only the journals as you go along that reconstruct that imaginative process. And it's entirely different. And that's the last point I really want to make. If there was such an account of how you do it, you would find that it wasn't the logical, orderly sequence that some of you are led to believe. You all read the finished accounts. You read the books and the famous articles and books by people in your fields. And you probably think that's how they did it. They got their book and they started at chapter 1 and they wrote through to the end, and that was their famous book. That isn't how any of us work. Most of all my PhD students don't know what the question is until the last few weeks of their PhD. They rearrange the whole thing in a new shape. They're full of indecision, they're full of confusion, they don't know which way they're going. They try out this, they try out that. Virginia Woolf has a lovely description of this, trying all sorts of strategies to solve problems. And there's much more chance and accident in all this process. Now, most people are too busy making their discoveries and doing their work ever to write down what they think they're doing as they go along. For some bizarre reason of self-reflexivity, I'm actually interested in that. And so, if you happen to be interested in what people actually do at the time and want a truthful account of what's happened, the only one that I know of in the world is on my website. In one of my books called The Savage Wars of Peace. While I was writing The Savage Wars of Peace, I wrote a book which I called The Autobiography of a Book. In other words, it was a kind of postmodernist joke about how the book was also writing an autobiography of itself, being written, which basically consists of all the letters, plans, assessments as it's going along. So it's got, before it was written, how I thought about it, a diary of the writing of it, and then some reflections afterwards. And even if you just dipped into it, in 5 minutes you'd see that I really didn't know what the book was going to be until quite late on. And I also talk quite a lot about some of the strategies which I use, like moving around, giving it a rest, working on several chapters at the same time, all sorts of things which you have to do if you're going to write a really good thesis or book. This is seldom described or discussed, and that's why I take the liberty of recommending something there. In fact, it couldn't really be published before. It's only of narrow marginal interest to a few people who are actually engaged in it, and so no publisher would publish such a book. So it had to wait till the web came along. So there's the finished book, and then there's the autobiography of the book on the website. So to conclude, these are just a few preliminary thoughts on autobiographical materials and diaries. Of course, I've only touched on corners of a great field. I have not mentioned the great Japanese tradition of autobiographical writing from Shei Sonagon to the 20th century. I have not gone into the dangers of these sources much. I mentioned that you have to be very wary of them. And saddest of all, I haven't been able to quote from any of my favourite authors, which would have filled up the hour very quickly. Yet the bibliographical suggestions which I've circulated will give you a chance to discover some of the joys of diaries and autobiographies and travel writing for yourself. I hope at least to have excited some of you by showing what pleasure, entertainment and insight can be gained from the restless activity of self-description and self-analysis, which has produced some of the most fascinating literature in the world. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?